Mrs. Sheila Logan has been working with UNEP for 13 years on issues relating to chemicals and wastes, with the highlight being her support for the negotiations on the Minamata Convention on Mercury. Her work on chemicals and waste has built on her previous work in the Department of Health and Aged Care in Australia, where she worked as a regulatory toxicologist assessing pesticides and industrial chemicals. So as usual, this will be a 15 to 20-minute presentation, followed by a Q&A session and a discussion. So please wait till the end to ask your questions. If any of you have trouble seeing the PowerPoint, please let me know. Don't hesitate to send an email to Lucie, Lucie, at pureearth.org. And I will be sure to send you a PDF of the PDF version of the PowerPoint to allow you to follow along. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Sheila.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and thanks to all of you. Welcome to this afternoon's session. My talk today will focus on the convention obligations of the Minamata Convention. So we'll run through the specific parts of the convention relating to artisanal and small-scale gold mining, both those in the specific article on ASGM, but also those in other areas of the convention. So if we look firstly at what the Minamata considers ASGM, for the purposes of the convention, it's artisanal and small-scale gold mining and processing in which mercury amalgamation is used to extract gold from ore. So it only covers a small subset, well, a major subset of the artisanal small-scale gold mining community. If people are simply panning for gold, for example, their activities are not covered under the convention. The first obligation we see in the convention is in paragraph 2 of Article 7, where it indicates that parties with ASGM shall take measures to reduce and, where feasible, eliminate the use of mercury and mercury compounds and emissions and releases of mercury and mercury compounds to the environment. This means that every country who's a party to the convention who has any artisanal small-scale gold mining using mercury has to work with those miners, work with the community to reduce that use. The next part of the obligation is that if a party determines that they have more than insignificant amounts of artisanal small-scale gold mining, they have to notify the Secretariat. Then they have an obligation to develop a national action plan, to submit it to the Secretariat, and then to review that plan every 3 years and report on that to the Conference of the Parties. The requirements of the National Action Plan are set out in Annex C, and we'll go through those in some detail when we go through the guidance relation to national action plans. Additionally to these, parties may cooperate to achieve the objectives. Cooperative activities are frequently more successful than each party working in isolation, but you'll note this is not an obligation under the convention. It's an opportunity for parties to benefit from cooperation. Under Annex C, the provisions covered here include national objectives and reduction targets, a list of the worst practices that parties have an obligation to eliminate, information or steps to be taken in terms of formalisation or regulation, a requirement for baseline estimates, a snapshot picture of where you are in relation to ASGM within your country, a schedule for the implementation of your national action plan, and a variety of strategies relating to that. There's also additional strategies, including cooperation, for example, which may be useful to achieve the objectives. And we note here that one of the strategies highlighted in Annex C is a public health strategy, which encompasses health surveillance, healthcare worker trainer, and awareness training. Looking elsewhere in the convention, there are other obligations which tie into the work on ASGM. The first of these relates to the primary mercury mining. We're aware that throughout the world there are a number of countries who are mining mercury at this stage, and as parties to the convention, they are not allowed to undertake new primary mercury mining at the date of entry into force of the convention for them. So for example, we know of mines in both Mexico and China that are currently mining mercury as a primary production. They cannot open any new mines after the 16th of August, which is when the convention will enter into force for them, being among the first 50 countries that ratified the convention. They have 15 years to continue to mine mercury as primary mining, but the important part for artisanal and small-scale gold mining is that it is not allowed under the convention for mercury obtained from primary mines to be used in ASGM. This mercury can only be used in relation to mercury-added products or processes that use mercury. There is no potential for countries to use that mercury in artisanal gold mining, and they have a responsibility to try to ensure that mercury from primary mines that is exported from their territory is not used for that in other countries. Another key obligation that feeds into ASGM is that parties shall endeavour to identify mercury stocks of more than 50 tonnes and mercury sources of supply generating stocks of more than 10 tonnes per year. This will give a picture for parties as to how much mercury they have on hand and how much mercury they're producing, and that will assist where they're trying to regulate artisanal and small-scale gold mining that uses mercury in terms of how much mercury may be available at the national level. Parties also have an obligation to dispose of excess mercury from decommissioning chlor-alkali facilities. Chlor-alkali facilities are responsible for large quantities of mercury. They frequently have many tons of mercury in the facilities. And under the convention, that mercury, when the chlor-alkali plant closes, cannot be sent out to artisanal mining. So these provisions under Article 3 are all designed towards cutting off some of the big sources of supply for artisanal and small-scale gold mining. Another aspect of the trade controls is that there's control on the movement of mercury. So as a party, you can only receive mercury when you consent to its import. An exporter is not allowed to send mercury to a party without that importing party's written consent. And it's only allowed for use allowed to the importing party under the convention or for storage. Now, ASGM is a use allowed, so it's quite acceptable for a country that has major mercury use in artisanal mining to consent to the import of mercury. However, they may use this as part of the strategy for managing that artisanal small-scale gold mining by limiting how much mercury is imported on an annual basis. Non-parties can also limit how much mercury is sent to them from parties. So if you have a country, an exporting party, they have to get written consent from a non-party before they can send mercury to them. Countries can have a general notification of consent to import, and with this they can get as much mercury as people want to send them from wherever. So that's not necessarily a great option for giving you good information on how much mercury you have or for assisting you with the controls of mercury at the national level. Turning now to another relevant article for ASGM, and that's the article dealing with the environmentally sound interim storage of mercury and mercury compounds that do not fall within the means of mercury waste. So this would apply any mercury that's being imported into a country or being held within a country for use within the artisanal small-scale gold mining sector would have to look at the provisions for Article 10. It applies to mercury and mercury compounds intended for a use allowed. So as we said previously, ASGM is allowed to under the convention, but when you're holding on to your mercury prior to its use, it has to be stored in an environmentally sound manner. And this must take into account any guidelines or requirements adopted by the COP. Currently, the COP has in front of it an initial draft guideline on interim storage, and it's expected that this may be available for use after the first meeting of the Conference of the Parties, which is being held at the end of September. And then after that, countries will have guidance on how they should store mercury when they're waiting for it to be used. And then there's also an aspect of having cooperation between parties and with other entities to enhance capacity building for environmentally sound interim storage. Another key article is Article 16, which relates to health issues. As we highlighted earlier, one of the actions in the National Action Plan is to look at a health strategy. Article 16 looks at making contributions towards the objective of the Convention to protect human health and the environment, and to look at how you can reduce environmental levels of mercury through decreasing emissions and releases. The focus in this article is on populations at risk, particularly vulnerable populations. The definition of vulnerable populations is one that gets considered in detail in some areas. Mining communities are in general vulnerable because of the high levels of exposure, but there are members within that community that have particular high sensitivities. So, for example, because the greatest effects of mercury are seen on infants and the unborn child, where they can cause permanent neurodevelopmental effects, women of childbearing age are frequently considered a vulnerable population of their own, as well as their children being a vulnerable population. And so under Article 16, there's encouragement to identify and protect populations at risk, and to look at establishing education and prevention programs, appropriate healthcare services, and establish and strengthen institutional and health professional capacities. You'll find in some areas that the health professionals may not even potentially be aware of the effects of mercury on the population, or on how people may be exposed to mercury, and there is more education and training frequently needed on addressing that capacity and ensuring the population is provided with up-to-date and accurate information. Having spoken generally about the obligations of the Convention, we'll turn more specifically to the obligations of preparing a national action plan. And to assist countries in this, the governments have adopted or agreed to a guidance document. And this guidance document sets out an introduction on the issue, looking at ASGM and Mercury, looking at ASGM within the Minamata Convention, the steps for developing a national action plan, the contents of the national action plan, and mechanisms for promoting the market for mercury-free gold, and then look specifically at issues including gender, child labour, and ASGM. So in the introduction, there is a coverage of the Minamata Convention, its development and its scope, information about what's included in the guidance document, the structure of the guidance document, and how you may wish to use the document. The Artisanal Small-Scale Gold Mining and Mercury chapter looks at the ASGM sector with some overviews of the issues and looking at the general mercury use. The guidance document runs through the obligations, as I've set them out here, looking at the Article 7 and Annex C obligations, the other articles and provisions, and what are the requirements on parties in terms of submitting national action plans and the reporting requirements under the Convention. Looking at the next set, this is where you get into practical guidance on how to develop a national action plan. So it looks at the first step being establishing a coordinating mechanism and organisation process. This is the mechanism that will drive the development of the plan and ensure good contributions from all stakeholders, and to look that everyone's interests have been reflected within that. Then there's a step to develop a national overview. This is to take your snapshot of where you are with ASGM at this point in time. It allows better information about how much your implementation is going to cost and how big an effort it's going to be. It also provides a mechanism for, well, having set that you can then analyse progress against that. And then there's a section on setting goals and objectives. In setting these goals and objectives, countries are encouraged to be ambitious but not impossible. Set achievable goals and drive towards objectives, but ensure that you're doing your best to address the problems. The National Action Plan continues with looking at formulating an implementation strategy. And this would include a work plan in support of the National Action Plan and the objectives, an outreach plan, a timeline, and a budget. And in these steps, looking at the implementation strategy and before that, the national overview and coordinating mechanism, it's important that countries look at having broad stakeholder engagement. it's not something that, for example, the Ministry of Environment or the Ministry of Mining can sit in their office in Capital and write out what the implementation strategy would be. They need broad ministerial involvement. They also need involvement of other stakeholders, communities, civil rights groups. There's a broad range of issues that come up when you're dealing with ASGM, and to be successful, it's important for a plan to look at how all of those aspects would be addressed. They're also, within the National Action Plan, it's important to have an evaluation process so that it's possible to see how the implementation of the plan went, whether it was successful. And then there's a formal endorsement of the National Action Plan by the government, and then submission of the National Action Plan to the Secretariat. This submission is part of the obligations under the Convention. So if we look at what's actually in the National Action Plan, as we said, you set objectives and reduction targets. How you set these targets is a matter of national choice. You may set them on a percentage use of mercury. You may set them on a population involved in mining. You may set them on a geographical coverage of where mining is done. The important thing is to choose measurable objectives and reduction targets that you feel are achievable and you're going to be able to make good progress towards them. Then you set up actions to eliminate the worst practices. The worst practices include things like whole ore amalgamation, where mercury is mixed with ore straight out of the ground without any concentration of the gold ore, and also things like combining mercury use with cyanide use. There are 4 worst practices. And here you'll see big mercury reductions if you actually reduce those particular practices. The next step of the National Action Plan is to look at the facilitation of formalisation or regulation of the sector. In a lot of cases, artisanal and small-scale gold mining is what we'd call informal. It's not, sometimes it's illegal, sometimes it's just unrecognised. And when you have a sector that's on the margins of society, it's very difficult to work with that community because there's concerns that their activities will simply be stopped by government. They'll get in trouble with the police, for example, and you don't have a good community network that you can reach out to. So that's why one of the steps in controlling ASGM is to look at how you can set up formal structures to deal with the mining communities. And then there's the need for the baseline estimates of ASGM use. You then look at strategies for reducing emissions releases and the risk of exposure, and this can include looking at options of moving away from mercury in gold mining, or the use of capture devices such as retorts to reduce the emissions of mercury, and also things like moving where some of the activities that involve exposure to mercury into different areas, away from communities, for example. Then there's looking at managing the trade of mercury and mercury compounds and preventing diversion for use in ASGM. I talked earlier about the provisions under Article 3, where countries have the ability to restrict imports of mercury. This only works when it's formal trade, when it's trade that's actually going through customs officials and recognised border points. You have a lot of challenges in a lot of areas where the mercury is actually moving through open or porous borders, or it's being imported or exported illegally against the national law. And looking at mechanisms to prevent this happening is one of the ways to help deal with the mercury problem in mining. The National Action Plan will need to have strategies for involving stakeholders in the implementation and continuing development of the National Action Plan. You need the communities on board, you need the miners on board, otherwise it has a much less chance of success. There needs to be a public health strategy, and as I said, this can primarily focus on preventing exposure of vulnerable populations to mercury used in ASGM. You also need to consider where that exposure is happening. Is it exposure at mine sites? Is it exposure at processing facilities? Or is it exposure downstream from the releases of mercury, for example, into rivers, etc.? Another key thing to consider in this is to look at how you're going to provide your information to artisanal and small-scale gold miners, to gold processors and affected communities. Frequently, artisanal and small-scale gold mining is driven by poverty. You may be looking at populations that are among the poorest and poorest people in your population with the least access to information. There may be low literacy rates, for example. So if you're looking at how to provide information, you need to structure it around that. You also have things that frequently miners are working in a situation where they're trying to keep aspects secret. They don't want people to know where their mine site is, for example. They don't want them to know how much mercury they're using or how much gold they're mining. So coming across those barriers and looking to tackle how to get them information is another key thing to look at strategies for. You need to have a schedule for implementation. You need to have set out some ideas of when you expect actions under the National Action Plan to be carried out, and if you're going to have a completion date or if you're going to have an ongoing process to set milestones for that implementation. The last two chapters of the guidance, the first covers mechanisms for promoting the market for mercury-free gold. And this is something that the UNEP Global Mercury Partnership Area on ASGM has been working on, and others, including the Artisanal Gold Council and other NGO groups, have worked strongly on the concept that there is encouraging a market for mercury which is produced for gold which is produced not using mercury, potentially not using other chemicals, and looking at the general gold market, but also specifically at niche markets. So some high-end jewelers are keen on looking at how they can access green gold or gold without the chemical taints associated with mercury or cyanide, for example. So this is an ongoing process, and this is one of the aspects that is covered under activities towards ASGM, particularly some of those funded by the Global Environment Facility. The last area in here is looking at gender, child labour and ASGM. There is some child labour going on. It's frequently a family activity. So you will do things like some areas of the mine may be small or restricted, and so children are used to access those areas of the mine. You also have just children at mine sites because there's nowhere else for them to be. Their family is mining there. While traditionally men have been involved in a lot of the mining work, it's also true that women are frequently involved in the use of mercury, the amalgamation with gold, and then the burning off to release the mercury and smelt the gold. So this is another area that the guidance looks at. So that covers in general the obligations under the Minamata Convention, both in the article specifically related to ASGM and also other articles, and also briefly runs through the guidance on developing a national action plan for your ASGM. I hope that's been useful information, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheila, very much for that informative presentation. This is Rachel here at Pure Earth and the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution. I had a question for you regarding the slide that you had on provisions for artisanal gold mining under the convention. I feel very ignorant because I don't understand what this particularly means, but I think it would be great if you could shed some light on. Use some wording for the convention of a nation has to determine if they have more than an insignificant amount of ASGM. Is that determined somewhere in the fine text, or is it left up to countries to determine what significant or insignificant amounts mean?
That's actually, it's left up to countries. This is a point that governments struggled a lot with as they were negotiating the convention. The intention behind it is that if you have a situation where you have an insignificant amount of ASGM, so perhaps you have a single community that's 10 miners and they produce gold using mercury, you wouldn't want to necessarily go to the whole stage of developing a national action plan and submitting it and reviewing it. However, it's well recognised that if you have a big ASGM problem, you're going to need all these other steps with national action plan, etc. The in negotiating this, the government's tried quite a lot of times to try and look at setting a threshold where they could say, if it's less than this, you just have to try and control it. If it's more than this, you need the national action plan, etc. And they really couldn't find a suitable threshold. And they couldn't actually get agreement as to what you would use for a threshold. So they used this terminology of more than insignificant and left it up to each individual party to decide. So some parties are using a quantity of gold produced using ASGM. Some are using the number of miners involved, the area of their territory, the amount of mercury used, and it's their determination of this. So no one questions whether a party has taken the right factors into play when they're considering this. Essentially, if a party declares that for them it's more than insignificant, then they're happy to take on these obligations. For some countries, they may decide that 100 kilos of gold produced, then that's not significant and we don't want to look at it. But it is very much defined on a party.
Oops.
Oops. Sheila, could you maybe repeat that? You seem to be cutting in and out. Sheila, are you still there?
I think we might have lost her for a second. And,
Yeah, she has problems with
hopefully she'll be
internet
back.
connection where she is. So
Yeah. Well, that was actually did help answer my question. So I don't know if anyone else has any other questions while we're waiting for Sheila to come back. Oh, she can hear everyone, she says.
yes.
Okay.
Can
Does anyone else have any questions?
Sorry, go ahead. Any other questions from the audience? Well, if I may, I did have a small question, Sheila. I don't know if you can hear me. You mentioned when you spoke about Article 16 that the parties are encouraged to promote education and prevention programs. Does it mention somewhere in the convention or in the other document you mentioned what kind of education and prevention programs can be put into place? Some examples? I know it can depend on the country, but would that be something that's mentioned there?
Oh dear, I think Sheila, you can hear us, but we can't hear you.
Here, if you give me a second, I'm going to go see if I can figure it out. She's right next to me.
Okay.
Thank you. I may be good on secretariat aspects, but I'm hopeless on technical. We think we've solved that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I had a separate control. I borrowed a headset and it had a separate control. I managed to mute on that. I'm sorry about that. Okay. The examples of education and prevention programs. There aren't any examples in the convention text itself. We work closely with the World Health Organization, and they are developing recommendations for guidance on the National Action Plan, the health aspects of that. And I think in that they will be looking at providing more examples and guidance as to what might be considered an education program or a prevention program. But there is a lot of flexibility for parties to simply consider what they consider suitable on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Rachel or Lisa? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, another question. One of the things that Pure Earth has been working on is how to identify contaminated sites, and also with mercury in particular, and also how to remediate very contaminated sites, particularly those that are associated with artisanal gold mining sites. Do you know if there's any plans to include guidance documents for parties for these two topics, or if the remediation of mercury contaminated sites is something that's perhaps going to be considered in the future?
The guidance document does talk a bit about contamination of sites during mercury mining and has some sections in relation to contaminated sites. But in addition to that, there's another article in the convention, Article 14, which deals specifically with contaminated sites. The obligations under the convention are more limited. Parties are required to endeavour to identify contaminated sites, but there's not actually a remediation obligation under the convention. We are in the process of looking at developing guidance for contaminated sites. Following the last meeting of the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, we did a call for submission of relevant guidance documents, relevant guidance materials, and the materials that were submitted included the guidance from Pure Earth, guidance from IPEN, and also a lot of government guidance. And so coming forward, the first meeting of the Conference of the Parties will consider where it goes from here on contaminated sites. So the Secretariat has been asked to provide a roadmap to work towards the development of guidance on contaminated sites. This includes aspects covered under the convention, including not only identification, but risk management measures and how to deal with managing contaminated sites in an environmentally sound manner. So we're hoping that come September, we'll have a mandate to do some more work on that. And then we'll be working hopefully through groups of experts to further develop the contaminated sites guidance. The structure we've used, we were asked to provide a structure and content for that, and the structure and content we've used for that is structured around the obligations under the convention, but it includes brief descriptions. And I think, as you're familiar with the Pure Earth guidance, you'll see a lot of similarities, because essentially there's a lot of good material out there and we've drawn on what was available. We don't believe in reinventing things if people have done a very good job on them. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to be working further on those. And we're also hoping that our mandate to involve experts will be able to encompass stakeholders. So we'd be looking not only at government experts, but also experts from non-governmental organisations and even industry. Remediation is a challenging issue because of the cost issue, of course. And so I think that's why there's not strict remediation obligations under the convention.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Thank you so much, Sheila, for shedding light on that for the audience and those who may view this presentation post.
Sheila, did you want to add anything else?
No, I think that completes that. I just have a quick plug for the first meeting of the Conference of the Parties. We will be meeting in September this year. The convention enters into force on the 16th of August, and the first meeting of the Conference of the Parties starts on the 24th of September. It will be held here in Geneva, and we're looking forward to participation by a broad range of people, governments, industry, NGOs, interested academics are able to attend as well. So look forward to having some of you there at that meeting. Thank you very much.
Please note that recordings of this presentation and the past presentations will be and are available on the GAP website. We definitely hope that you will join in for the next session, The next session will actually be in Spanish, but it'll be taking place on Thursday, July 13th, a bit later than usual. And it'll be on the good practices in alluvial gold mining to facilitate adequate recovery of contaminated areas. Meanwhile, please don't hesitate to follow us on our GAP websites and to find out more about the upcoming info session themes. As usual, the connection info will be the same. Thank you all very much for your attention, and thank you very much, Sheila.